This afternoon we're going to discuss two battles in the Great War, also known as the First World War. The first one is the Battle of Jutland, which was the largest surface Navy ship battle in the First World War. The second battle would be the first example of blitzkrieg in the past century, and this was against the Italian army, and it was by the German army, which was against the worst army in the First World War of the major powers. The battle showed that old waves die hard. They die very hard. As we get older, we want to use the ways that we used in the past, and we don't adapt to the new ones. And this was very true of the British Navy in this battle. They got their comeuppance. The British ships were fast. They had thick armor. They had thin armor, and they had big guns. The German ships were slower, had more armor, and also big guns. And we'll also discuss men who influenced the Battle of Jutland that were not in the Battle of Jutland. What you see on the screen on the left is Sir Winston Churchill. Everybody knows him. The middle man is Admiral Sir John Fisher, who was a naval genius. And we'll discuss him. And the man on the right, look at that nice mustache, was an Italian naval architect, Admiral Vittorio Cuniberti. He, in 1900, designs a battleship with 12-inch guns. And when this fired a broadside, wow, look out, now watch. That's battleship Queen Mary. And look what happens to it when it gets hit by a German broadside. One, it gets hit, and two, it disappears. It has disappeared. This is all in 10 minutes. 10 minutes, remember that. So, and then we're going to be talking about people who influenced Jutland, never went to high school, never went to college. One of them even received a Nobel Prize. So let's go back to Churchill. Churchill and the man in the middle there, Admiral John Fisher, have much in common in their childhood. Churchill's father died when he was a young lad. His mother sends him to a boarding school. Send him to a boarding school. For Christmas, he writes home, "I want to come home for Christmas." And his mother says, "You can't come home, I have guests, and your room is already taken." So he develops an emotional attachment, not to his mother, but to his nanny. And at a certain point, the mother, as Churchill gets older, the mother fires the nanny. Now, the nanny has no skills, no money, no unemployment, no pension, nothing, and just goes to her sister for a dish of food and a roof. So, okay, he starts sending her money and pays for her funeral. The man in the middle is a naval genius. He was born in Ceylon, which is today we call Sri Lanka. His parents had a tea plantation. they suffer financial reversals. At age 6, remember, age 6, he's put on a boat to go to England to live with his grandfather. Remember, 6 years old, on a boat for months. Finally gets to England, lives with his grandfather, and now his grandfather suffers financial reversals. Wow. So what does the grandfather do? Puts him in the Navy. Here he is, 11 years old. He's a naval cadet. And he's in the Navy on a ship. And the first day he's there, they are flogging 6 sailors. Flogging means whipping. 50 lashes. He faints. Poor kid. Now, he's in a program that as you start taking tests, you progress. At the time, there was no Naval Academy. So by the age of 33, he's a captain. This is the equivalent of a colonel in the Army. So I'm sure the men here that have been in the Army do not know any colonels who are 33. He is now starting to revamp the British Navy. He's put in charge of a Navy yard where they build ships. And there's one step in the shipbuilding that takes 3 days. He figures it out to be 2 hours. Then he is put in charge of ordnance. And he realizes that torpedoes have a range of 2.5 miles, and the guns on the British ship have a range of 1.5 miles. So either a ship or a submarine could stay out and torpedo the British ship, so he changed that. He started to give fresh baked bread to the men on the ship. Before that, they were eating hard biscuits, and the hard biscuits contain bugs. I mean, I can go on and on and on. At one point, the Navy refused to put him on a ship because he was so valuable. He was giving the Navy so much information. Here he is with Churchill, and look at the spats. This is what is worn. You see the spats over the shoe? That's what was worn at that time. Okay. Now, each of these men had a famous saying. Churchill says, "We fight today's battles with last war's equipment." To give you an example, in the Second World War, President Roosevelt allocates steel to build submarines to sink Japanese merchant vessels. Japan would need importation of rubber and tin and oil to continue the war. But the Navy admirals, instead of building submarines, they built battleships which were never used in battle. On the bottom, you see here, this is the word wireless. That's the British word for radio. And airship, airplane. It's the radio that has revolutionized warfare. That's what is being said. So let's see who the men were that involved in building the wireless and the airship that we call an airplane. The first guy involved in building the wireless, we're talking of the radio, is Guglielmo Marconi. He was born in north central Italy in the 1880s. Very wealthy family. His mother was a Jameson. If anybody here knows about Scotch whiskey, she was the granddaughter of the founder of Jameson Scotch whiskey. His next door neighbor was a professor of physics at the University of Bologna. So he got involved in this, and he was very wealthy, and his family had tutors at home, and he was interested in physics and chemistry, but never went to college. Now, if you Google him, Google will say he went to the University of Bologna. Bologna is one of the universities I graduated from. I met with the president there, and he told me that Marconi was, in Italian, I'll say it because there are some Italian-speaking people here, autodidatta, which means self-taught. It's like automobile. We use the word automobile, which means self-propelled. Okay, he now realizes that he's got something cooking there. He's 19 or 20. He has an invention that right from here, he can push a button and start a bell ringing across the room. So he is getting the sound waves. And everybody in this room, if you have a cell phone, this is what we're talking about. If you have a cell phone right from this room, you can call the checkout desk or you can call China, whichever you prefer. So he goes to a bank and gets, for a big loan, gets turned down. Now the communication industry in Europe was run by the post office. So he writes to the Postmaster General in Italy, and the Postmaster General said, send this guy to the Lugano. Lugano was the insane asylum in Rome. They thought he was crazy. So his mother takes him to England. And going across the English Channel, he lands in Dover. And the customs official said, what are all these tools you got here? And he explained it to the customs official. Customs official puts him in room with in contact with the British Navy and with the post office. Each of them gave him money. Now the tragedy is that the British Navy financed this guy and then refused to use the radio on the ships. They were using flags, which to me is stupid. Okay, so now he is he starts a radio company, Marconi Wireless Corporation. If you've seen the movie The Titanic, there were 2 employees of Marconi on that ship. The steamship line would not pay for them, so he paid for them. And then here's where, in 1912, it turned out, hey, you need radios in these ships at sea. Okay, now the big thing is the British Navy in 1904 had turned down the radio, saying this was a toy. And in the Battle of Jutland, as they maneuvered about, how did they contact each other? By flags, the way they did 100 years before. So 100 years before, with the sailboats, the ships were going 5 miles an hour. Now they're doing 25 or 30 miles an hour. And the other guy is doing 25 or 30 miles an hour, and that's close to 50, 60 going at each other. So that's the big defect in the British Navy regarding the radio. Now we're going to talk about this guy. This guy is on the cover of Time magazine, famous magazine here in the United States, July 4th, 1926. His name is Giuseppe Sciacca. He's born in Sicily. graduates from the Polytechnic Institute in Milan in 1911. Think it, 1911. In 1903, the Wright brothers had made their first flight. So he wants to build a passenger plane. Remember what I'm saying? Passenger plane. He goes to a bank, and the bank asks him 2 questions. Are you a pilot? No. Have you ever built a plane before? No. So he gets turned down. But he has a brother who migrated to Brooklyn, New York, which is one of the boroughs of New York City. The brother says, come to Brooklyn, we'll get you the financing. He goes to Brooklyn, goes to a bank, same questions, same answers. How did he get the money? This shows you what made this country great. He gets financing from the chef and the waiters where he ate. And the lawyer who drew up the paper was a young attorney by the name of Fiorello LaGuardia, LaGuardia Airport in New York. So now this guy here, Belanca, says, I don't have the money to pay you, but I'll tell you what. I'll teach you to fly a plane, and you teach me to drive a car. And that's what happened. So they couldn't build a plane right away because the First World War broke out, and they built it after the war. Now look, that's Wilbur Wright, 1909 in Rome. He's trying to sell this plane to the Italian army. The American army wouldn't buy it. The Italian army, nobody would buy it except the French. And finally, some wealthy Italians purchased it and donated it to the Italian army. So this is the way an airplane was in 1909. That plane is what was built by Giuseppe Belanca. It is in the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. Now, here you got, look what happened. Radio and aviation before, and you've got here the radio. The British had the radio before, and during, they used flags. Germans had it all the time. The same thing with the aviation. And on the bottom, Admiral Jellicoe, he was the commander of the British fleet. He was totally unaware of what was going on. Awful. These are the errors that the British committed. Omission. We're going to discuss that. Number one, they didn't have radios for communication. Number two, they didn't have aviation, and we'll see why. Now the ships at Jutland, if you see the battle cruisers, they had 12-inch guns. Battleships were a little bigger, and they had more armor, and their guns were bigger. Now, how were the ships deployed? The battleships would be right here, like I'm the battleship. To my right and to my left and to my rear are destroyers and cruisers to protect the battleship from submarines with torpedoes. 20 or 30 miles in front of the battleships are the battle cruisers. They are the scout ships. And the name of the game is the battle cruiser is supposed to find the enemy ship, then make a U-turn, and lead the enemy ships right to the battleship. That's the way it was. And we're going to see that in a minute. Now, the fifth battle, then there was a special unit in the British fleet of 27,000 tons. These were the most powerful ships afloat. They had 15-inch guns. Sir, 15-inch gun had a shell weighing almost a ton, 1,938 pounds. The 12-inch guns, the shell weighed 850 pounds. Now, another thing. The British started decoding the German radio traffic, which was in code. And they picked up different things. They picked it up from a ship here and a ship there and in the Dutch coast and also in Australia. But this was all new for the British, remember that. And sometimes they sent out wrong information, and we're going to see that during the battle. Now, when I give this lecture, people ask me, how you didn't have any aircraft carrier in those days. No, you did not. But you had special ships that would have 5 to 10 airplanes on the deck. They would pick a plane, lower it into the water. You see the cable? That's the cable. Lower into the water, and then the plane would take off, do a scouting, 100, 200 miles, and then come back and report whatever they've seen. And this is very important for the commander of the fleet, because he has to know where are the enemy ships, how are they deployed, what formation, what speed, things like that. Very important. This is the commander of the British fleet, Admiral John Jellicoe. He makes one big error of omission. The British fleet is go, 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 and they don't sit and think. He runs to the port. There is a ship loaded with planes that has not been notified that the fleet is sailing, because that code room has told the fleet the German fleet is going to sea. He does not wait for the ship that carries the planes, and therefore the whole battle, he is blind. This is Admiral David Beatty. Beatty had quite a life. See the way he's wearing his hat on an angle? That's against British naval policy. He only has 3 buttons. British naval policy, you have to have 4. He doesn't care. When he was born, his mother was not married to his father. She was married to somebody else. And it makes me laugh, because here we are talking about the Victorian age. Everything has to be prim and proper, no alcohol, none of this and none of that. But the upper 1 or 2% did what they wanted. Churchill's wife's mother had 5 children. She did not know who the father was of her. She was married. She had 5 children, but she did not know who the father was of her 5 children. And she admitted this to her children. So that's something. So he goes to sea as a naval cadet, and while he's a Navy officer, he meets a married woman. Falls in love. She's married with a son. She's the daughter of Marshall Field. If the ladies here go shopping, they've heard of Marshall's, the department store. And they fall in love, and her father pays off her husband and marries him, and she marries him. But being David Beatty, he's not faithful. His wife's not faithful. I can't understand why these things happen, but they did. But this guy was also a tremendous naval officer. He's progressing, and he's offered the command of the Atlantic, second in command of the Atlantic Fleet. He said, no, I want to be in command. And therefore, he goes on the retired list. But then Churchill grabs him, makes him his secretary, and when there's an opening, he becomes the commander of the battle cruiser squadron. These are the Germans. Up on the top on the left is Hipper. On the bottom is Scheer. Scheer on the bottom is the commander of the German fleet. Now, the British fleet sails. Here, they've sailed from one port, from another port, and another one here. And here are the Germans coming up. This is in the North Sea, very misty, very foggy. Now, Beatty is the leader of the battle cruiser. He's up front, and his ships are in three columns. The northernmost column is the most powerful fleet in the world, the one with 15 inches. Here, this is the battleship of the 5th Battle Squadron, of those ships with 15-inch guns. Now we come into the battle. The red are German and the blue are British. We have here Beatty sees a Danish freighter, and he goes to investigate. Is it really a Danish freighter, or is it a battleship in disguise? The Germans are checking at the same time. He didn't know that. And now the Germans started firing at him, at his ship. Okay, the battle is joined. So when this happens, Beatty, which you see here, the blue, he goes, instead of going east, he's going southeast. He wants to cut off the Germans from their base. But he's supposed to tell even Thomas that. But he does it by flags. And in the mist, the big ships that I just showed you, they don't get the message. So he's going southeast, they're going east, and they're 10 miles apart before the situation is noted. Now, okay, he's going south, south, south. Now, and they're firing at each other here. And down here, the red is the big German fleet coming up. When Beatty sees the big German fleet coming up, he makes a U-turn, and he starts going north. And the big ships up here that finally have caught on, they're going south while he's going north. Crazy. Now they start to fire. This is Beatty's battle cruiser. This is a gun turret. The top gets ripped off. Everybody in there gets killed. The commander of the turret is a Major Harvey. His legs are blown off. He issues the order. Now, to give you how this ship is constructed, you have the turret is here. Then you have a hoist. And then right below it is the magazine where all the ammunition is. The turret is on fire. The fire can spread down into the ammunition. That'll blow up the ship. So he gives the order, flood the magazine way in the bottom here, down here. and that saves the ship. But the men in the magazine drowned because they locked the door, flooded it, they drowned, but the ship was saved. I mean, that is tremendous discipline. This is the battle cruiser Indefatigable. Within 10 minutes, this goes to the bottom. Now here's another. This guy is 16 and a half years old. If you have any children or sons or grandson, think of it. This boy, this is a painting, not a photograph. This boy is 16 and a half. He's working on a gun crew on a cruiser. The turret gets blown off. Everybody gets killed. He has pieces of steel in his chest, in his back, in his head, and he's bleeding all over, and he's waiting there for orders. Everybody else around him has been killed. So they bring him to the hospital the next day. He dies. He gets awarded the Victoria Cross, which is the highest decoration in England. It's like the Congressional Medal of Honor. But think of it, 16 and a half. Wow. Now, in the meantime, while all this is going on, Beatty, which is like 20th, Jellicoe, the commander of the British Navy with the battleships, he's waiting. He wants news. What's going on? But he's the guy that wouldn't wait for the airplanes. And if I have somebody shooting at me, I have to bother with the guy shooting at me. I haven't got time to make conversation. So he does not know what's going on. And here he is in a formation. These ships are next to him, 7 miles wide. So finally he gets the news. Hey, the Germans are here. So he goes from 7 miles wide to one aisle, one row. That's it. These are the Germans coming up here. And this is Jellicoe with the battleships. Now the big thing in Navy is what they call crossing the T, and I'll explain that to you in a minute. Right here, Jellicoe is firing at the German ships. This is crossing the T, and then we're going to go back to that slide. The upright is the T. These ships are firing. These ships have an easy time of firing on these guys. Instead, these ships cannot fire. And that's what you call crossing the T, which is a fantastic naval maneuver. Jellicoe does this twice. Now watch what the Germans do. The Germans, they turn around. They make a circle turn, which is a tremendous feat of naval maneuvering, tremendous. And they did this twice. Now, the Germans realize, hey, we've got the whole British fleet here, 150 ships. We can't handle them. We better go home. So now they start going home right here. And it's getting dark. It's like 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night. And the British will not pursue them in the dark. Will not pursue. And now Jellicoe, the British admiral, has to decide where are the German ships going to be tomorrow morning. And this is going to be hard because there are 3 places. He tries to cover all 3 from one spot, which is impossible. So the German fleet is headed home. The British don't know where they are. And in the meantime, that code room that I talked to you a minute ago is sending Jellicoe, says, hey, the German fleet is in the port. Well, that's stupid communication. They're not in the port. They're firing at me. So all the communications were errored, but there was one communication that they decoded that the Germans asked German Navy headquarters that tomorrow morning they wanted Zeppelin over a place called Horns Reef. That would tell you which port the Germans were headed. And they never, the communications never got to Jellicoe. So now the Germans are headed home. This is a ship, it's a cruiser, goes after a wounded German ship. This heavy cruiser, Lutzow, blows it out of the water, and then this German ship gets wounded and had to be sunk by the Germans. Now, there's a little dock, and a small cruiser gets close to this ship, which is 17,000 tons, and torpedoes it. And this is the biggest British victory in the whole battle right there. Now, who won and who lost? On the bottom here, British, over 6,000 dead. Germans, 2,551. And there you have all the things. The Germans, after this, never went to sea. The British were very upset about it, what had happened, and they changed a lot of their procedures. And that's all we have to say on the Battle of Jutland. Anybody have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Did they have pocket battleships at that time?
No. Pocket battleships were in the Second World War. All the weight was in the guns. Like you had some that were 10,000 tons, but they had 15-inch guns. Second World War. There was also like the Hood, which was 24,000 tons, Second World War, meets the Bismarck, and in 10 minutes, the Hood is sunk. In less than 10 minutes, with over 2,000. There's a story about the Hood. It's emotional. The British radio, this is Second World War, the British radio reports the Hood is sunk and over 2,000 are dead. So one lady, retired, had her son on the ship, and she's in mourning. And then 2 days later, there's a knock on her door. She opens the door, and it's her son. She thought he was dreaming. There were 2 survivors out of 2,000. So when these battleships get hit, there's a tremendous loss. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Wasn't the British more casual about their concept of
All right.
engagements?
I'm sorry. What was that?
Wasn't their concept was to throw as much lead as possible. So their safety precautions weren't as extensive as the Germans.
You're exactly right. You had the shell, and then you had sacks of something called cordite, which is 5% Vaseline, 5% Vaseline, 40% nitroglycerin, which is dynamite, and the rest was cellulose. And these were in bags. And the 2 bags were in a metal container. But the British Navy wanted at least 2 firings per minute. So they would leave all these bags all around the gun turret and even on the hoist. bags that were open. And this was called cordite and had a tendency to self-explode. Boom! You know, like the firemen tell you, don't put that in your house because it has like oil, rags soaked in oil. Don't leave them there because they may have what you call spontaneous combustion. And that's what happened in some of these ships that I showed that were sunk. They did not have the safety precautions. You're right. Anybody else? Okay, now we're going to be talking about the Battle of Caporetto, which was the first blitz in the last century. And this was the Austrian and German army against the Italian army. And the Italian army, you can tell from my first and last name, I'm as Italian as you get, but calling the spade a spade, the Italian army was the worst army in the First World War, and there's a reason for this, and I'll explain it in a minute as soon as I get this slide all set.